Welcome back to Oil Painting Master Series, brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com. Today we'll look at blending oil paint, specifically the stitch method, bristle brushes, and soft brushes. What you will know: the rationale behind premixed values, how to apply oil paint for creating controlled gradients, and making soft edges versus hard edges. You will need white oil paint, black oil paint, a small canvas or panel, 6x8 or 8x10 will work, a 1/4 to 1/2 inch bristle brush, and a flat or round nylon brush of similar size. Let's get started. We'll begin by drawing a circle and dividing that circle into specific shapes to represent the different values that would fall across that circle were it a sphere. But first I'm going to go ahead and draw in part of another circle and a horizon line that may represent a table's edge, just to complete my composition. I want my light to come from the upper right, so this first shape on my circle represents the highlight area, and this donut shape that's around that would be the lightest gray value. Now that I've got different shapes wrapped around my circle to represent my different values, I'm just going to clean my drawing up by doing a little bit of erasing and also remove any excess graphite on my canvas that may mix into my paint. Before we begin painting, we'll need to mix some values. What I've done is use black and white just to mix a range of grays that are equally spaced out. This will be the darkest gray in my painting. So I have a range from white to dark gray represented in 5 values. From this point forward in the demonstration, I'll simply refer to the values as value 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Let's go ahead and clean off our palette before we begin from where we were mixing our paint. While the paint is still wet, it wipes off easily enough with a paper towel. Now, when I plan to paint in a very controlled manner, and I've already planned out where my different 5 values are going to go in these different shapes, I usually like to start from the left of any area that I'm going to work on and work towards the right. That keeps my hand out of the way. I'm going to start with value number 3 and apply it to the area on my sphere that would be called reflected light. This is where the light would pass from the right across my sphere and bounce back into the left edge of my sphere off of the surface on which the sphere rests. Now I'm going to use value number 4 and paint that in as the darkest value on my sphere. I'm saving value number 5 for something else. This zone on my sphere would be called the core of the shadow, the darkest area of our shadow. I'm not worried about blending my 2 values together just yet, but painting them in as separate shapes. Remember, between values, it's not necessary to wet your brush with paint thinner, only to wipe it out with a dry rag. If you were to use paint thinner to clean your brush, you would be introducing more liquid into your brush and possibly causing one value of your paint to be a thinner application than another value of paint. They wouldn't blend together consistently and predictably. Notice how large my brush is. Even though I'm working into tiny spaces, I'm still using a larger size brush. It's usually not necessary to use small brushes until the very end of a painting. I can clean up the edges of my sphere with the background color. There, now we have our reflected light in place the core of our shadow, and a midtone. I think I'm going to bring the reflected light down a step in value to match our midtone. I'm going to go ahead and paint the donut shape that I mentioned before in with value number 2. This is actually our lightest gray. Value number 1 is white. And again, I'm just trying to work up to the edge of the value that preceded it, not to blend those values together. There's an application phase and then a blending phase with this method. Even though the highlight is already white, with the white of the canvas, I still need to apply white paint to it so that I have something wet to work into with the gray that's around it. We'll go ahead and start doing that now. We'll begin the blending phase of the painting of our sphere. Now, this is a very small area, so I really only have to dab the border between the gray and the white with my brush in order to get them to blend together. There's no real need for a stroke here. We'll begin blending the grays together with a stitching stroke, a stroke that goes across the seam between the two values, and in fact in this case follows the contour of our sphere. And you can see that I've pulled a little bit of the light value into the midtone and vice versa. I'll do this again, same direction, and the values will blend together a little more the second time around. And I can continue to work across these two values using the stitch method, a stroke perpendicular to the original edge, until I feel that they've blended far enough into one another. I'm not worried about the strokes that I can see by using the stitch method. We'll remove those in a third step. Let's move on to the core of our shadow. We'll treat it the same as we did the midtone, only this time the midtone represents our lighter value. Again, I will just work a stroke across the edge of the seam between the two values, and because my edge is a curve, the direction of my stroke changed a little bit to follow the direction of the form, the sphere. At this point, we'll go ahead and blend our strokes together by using a nylon brush and by working our brush with very, very light touches perpendicular to the stitches that we made when we pulled our values together. It's important to note that I'm barely touching the canvas. This nylon brush is soft and flexible, and in fact it's too soft to move the paint around on our canvas. So all that it can really do is blend our strokes together, but not pull any paint from one area of our sphere to another. There, now there are no strokes. We'll go ahead and move on to our second sphere. It's really just a quarter of a sphere. And again, I'll start with the value on the left edge. This is the core of our shadow, then our midtone and our light. I'm going to use value number 3 to begin a shadow under and to the left of our complete sphere. And I'll also use some value number 2 in this cast shadow as we get farther out towards its tip. There we are. This cast shadow will give us an opportunity to work on our edge quality, wanting our shadow's edge to be very soft compared to the sphere. I'm going to use value number 5, finally, our darkest gray, as our background color, and this is the time where I will clean up the edge of my original sphere. In the event that I work beyond and outside of the lines, I can use this darker value almost like an eraser. I'm using the very tips of the bristles to paint the background as well as the rest of the painting. Notice that my paint doesn't make it up to the metal part of my brush. That's because the paint's very thick. I'm not using any medium to thin it out, and so I have to scrub it in with the points of the bristles instead of the side of the bristles. I'm going to use value number 2 for the ground plane, or the surface that our ball rests on, so that it get a little contrast between it and value number 3 used in the cast shadow. And again, the ground plane color can be used to sharpen the edge of our larger sphere in our foreground. We'll go back to our softer nylon brush and use it to blend the ground plane value and the shadow value together. And I'm not going to use the stitch method here. I'm just going to drag the tips of the bristles across the edge between the two values. The more I repeat the process of dragging it across that edge, the more that edge will seem to dissolve. As with the cast shadow, but to a lesser degree, I'm going to drag my nylon brush across the edge of our forward sphere and the ground plane to soften it and give it something of a fuzz or haze. This will encourage the viewer to see our original sphere, our whole sphere, as the focal point. And I'll do the same thing with our ground plane's edge, what you may interpret as the edge of a table that our sphere rests on. Just a few times I'll drag my soft brush across that edge so that it's a little bit softer than the original sphere and not as soft as the forward sphere. This gives us a lot of variety. Thanks for watching Oil Painting Master Series, brought to you by thevirtualinstructor.com.